Welcome to this explainer. I am so thrilled you're here today because we are diving straight into a truly fascinating theological synthesis. We're going to examine a source text that takes a really deep, meticulous look at the Mosaic Law, the teachings of Jesus, and this overarching concept of grace. If you've ever found yourself wondering how the strict, ancient rules of the Old Testament could possibly connect with the radical forgiveness of the New Testament, you are going to absolutely love how this material breaks it all down. So we're starting off with a massive, paradigm-shifting question. Are the law of Moses and the grace of Jesus truly opposites? It's a really common assumption today to just think that Old Testament law and New Testament grace are entirely separate, maybe even completely contradictory systems. But the source material we're digging into today argues something entirely different. It actually suggests that they aren't opposites at all, but rather two parts of the exact same continuous divine plan. And that brings us to this incredibly powerful quote from Romans chapter 3, verse 31. Do we then nullify the law through faith? May it never be. On the contrary, we establish the law. According to our source text, this right here is the core premise we really need to wrap our heads around. Faith and grace do not abolish the divine law. In fact, they completely uphold and establish it. Okay, here's our roadmap for today. First, the purpose of divine law. Second, Jesus as the lawgiver. Third, the hidden meaning of Torah. Fourth, divine law versus human tradition. Fifth, filial love and the law. And finally, number 6, the consequences of lawlessness. All right, let's jump right into part 1, the purpose of divine law, setting the standard. The author makes a crucial point right out of the gate here. We often think of the divine law as just this arbitrary set of rules designed to weigh people down, right? But the text argues it's not that at all. Instead, it is the very first written revelation of the actual character of God. The law sets the ultimate standard for what is right and wrong, and by doing so, it precisely defines what sin actually is. Because think about it, if you don't have the law, you literally don't have a clear definition of what violates God's character. Which leads us perfectly into Romans 3:20. By the law is the knowledge of sin. The text impartially conveys that the law was actually never meant to save anyone. No one except Christ is sinless. But it absolutely retains its usefulness today. Its whole job is to clearly inform us of what God thinks is right and wrong. It essentially acts as a mirror, holding up a reflection to show us exactly what sin is. Moving right along to section 2, Jesus as the lawgiver, the author of the law. Now, this part is fascinating. The text draws a very direct line between two identities. In the Old Testament, the lawgiver identified himself as Yahweh or El Shaddai. But in the New Testament, God became a man in the person of Jesus, or Yahshua in Hebrew, the Logos made flesh. The author's central argument here is that Jesus is actually the literal incarnation of Yahweh, meaning Jesus himself was the one who gave the law to Moses at Mount Sinai. He isn't just a teacher of the law, he is the original lawgiver. And Jesus actually says this himself in John 5:46. For if you had believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. The source points out how this tightly links the two figures together. Everything Moses wrote was prophetic of Jesus, because Moses was interacting with the very spirit of Christ. You just cannot separate the testimony of Moses from the words of Jesus. They are totally intertwined. So, let's get into section 3, which I absolutely love, the hidden meaning of Torah, pictorial Hebrew. Torah is simply the Hebrew word for law. But ancient Hebrew is a super unique language because it's both phonetic and pictorial. Every letter makes a sound, sure, but originally, every letter also functioned as a picture with a very specific meaning. Let's actually break the word Torah down. In Hebrew, it's spelled with 4 letters: Tav, Vav, Resh, and He. According to the text, the ancient pictorial meaning of Tav is a mark or a sign of the cross. Vav translates to a nail or a peg. Resh means a head or a leader. And He, when you put it at the end of a word, means what comes from. Now, what happens when you put those ancient pictures together? Well, the author points out that Torah literally translates to what comes from the leader nailed to the cross. Mind-blowing, right? It's this striking, embedded Christological message hidden right inside the ancient word for the law itself, pointing directly back to Jesus as the ultimate source. All right, section 4, divine law versus human tradition, correcting misuse. We really need to compare these two concepts carefully. On one side, we have divine law, which represents the pure mind and character of God. But on the other side, we have the traditions of men. The text argues that ancient rabbinical traditions, and frankly, even modern church traditions, things like accepting usury or altering the definitions of marriage, are often just carnal human interpretations. And over time, those human traditions actually end up invalidating the true divine law. So the author views the famous Sermon on the Mount through this exact lens. When Jesus said, "You have heard it said, but I say unto you," he wasn't abolishing his own rules. That wouldn't make any sense. He was acting as the original lawgiver, stepping in to correct human misunderstandings and Pharisaical traditions. He was stripping away all the human additions to reveal the pure original intent of his own law. This brings us to Section 5, Phileo Love and the Law, Learning Boundaries. We've got to talk about two specific Greek words for love here, phileo and agape. Agape is that divine, mature, totally unconditional love. Phileo, on the other hand, is brotherly love. And the text argues that the law of Moses is actually based entirely on love, specifically by defining phileo. Think of phileo as a legal kind of love. It teaches boundaries. It teaches you that loving your neighbor practically means not stealing their property or coveting what is theirs. The author uses this fantastic metaphor of parents refereeing siblings. If you've ever had to break up a fight over a toy, you know exactly what this looks like. When parents settle those disputes, they are teaching property rights and boundaries. They are teaching the law, which is step 1, filial love. Children absolutely must learn these legal boundaries so they don't grow up thinking they can just take whatever they want. It brilliantly illustrates how the law acts as essential training wheels. You have to learn the filio justice of the law before you can ever truly mature into step 2, the unconditional agape grace of Christ. And finally, Section 6, the consequences of lawlessness, an attitude of the heart. The source text highlights a really critical term from 1 John 3:4, anomia. It's the Greek word for lawlessness. It describes an attitude of despising or intentionally setting aside the divine law. According to the author, true biblical sin isn't just making a mistake. It is the very act of lawlessness itself. It's walking around acting as though God's standard of right and wrong simply no longer applies to you. So how does grace fit into all this? Well, the author uses a legal debt analogy. If you break the law, you owe a debt, and the law enslaves the debtor until it's paid. Because all humanity has sinned, we were all enslaved. Being under grace simply means that Jesus, our Redeemer, stepped in and paid our legal debt in full. The law no longer holds us captive. But, and this is a huge but, the text is totally adamant about this. Grace absolutely does not give believers a license to practice lawlessness. Christ didn't pay the massive debt just so we could freely keep racking up more. So the big takeaway from the author here is this. We were saved from the debt of sin to become slaves of righteousness. Justification, having our debt paid by faith, is really just step 1. What comes next is sanctification. And sanctification, according to the text, is the lifelong, ongoing process of learning obedience to God's divine law through the leading of the Holy Spirit. We don't discard the law. We finally learn how to keep it from the heart. So I want to leave you with this final thought. If unconditional grace is the ultimate destination, are you still using the divine law as the training wheels to shape your spiritual character today? It's a profound idea that really challenges us to see those ancient laws not as old burdens, but as the enduring character of God guiding our modern spiritual journey. Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this incredible material. Keep seeking, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.